Remember, you can find and subscribe to all the episodes of this podcast at historyasithappens.com. And you can sign up for my newsletter. Just enter your email in the box that pops up at the bottom of the screen. New episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter every Friday. historyasithappens.com. History as It Happens, August 18th, 2022. Why War Doesn't Work.
Is the aggression a threat not only to the immediate victim, but to the United States of America and to the peace and security of the entire world?
The enemy very deceitfully has taken advantage of the Tet truce in order to create maximum consternation.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
Downtown Baghdad this morning, we're seeing evidence of the collapse of any central regime authority. The streets are full of people celebrating.
Researchers at Johns Hopkins released a controversial study about the number of people who have actually died in Iraq since the war began. It's a huge number.
Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors.
Russia in Ukraine, Russia in Afghanistan, the U.S. in Afghanistan, Iraq and Vietnam, the French in Algeria and Vietnam. These are but a few examples of powerful countries failing to impose their will on weaker opponents. The illusion of military power as a means to an end. The illusion of total victory. Yet countries keep trying to make war work. Why does war fail? Sir Lawrence Freedman is here to answer that next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
You can say that they're winning, which is not the same saying that they will definitely win, because how you bring these wars to an end is, as we have already seen, very complicated.
In 1966, the Italian filmmaker Gio Pontecorvo's The Battle of Algiers hit theaters. It's a masterpiece about France's brutal colonial war in Algeria. In one memorable scene, the commander of the French counterinsurgency forces, Colonel Mathieu, tells a room full of reporters that the war came down to one question.
À mon tour maintenant de poser la question. La France doit-elle rester en Algérie?
Should France stay in Algeria? If your answer is still yes, then you must accept all the consequences. One of the consequences, according to the good colonel, was torture. The French were torturing Algerian captives to try to break the resistance. As Alistair Horn wrote in his classic history, A Savage War of Peace, in the Algerian War, what led, probably more than any other single factor, to the ultimate defeat of France was the realization, in France and the world at large, that methods of interrogation were being used that had been condemned under the Nazi occupation. Horn goes on to write, because of the slowness of communications in the 1950s and 60s, it took a year or more for the message of abuses perpetrated in Algeria to sink in. Now, with the internet and Al Jazeera, one set of photos from Abu Ghraib is enough to inflame hatred across the Islamic world against the West, providing excuse for all the beheadings and atrocities carried out by al-Qaeda. In the Battle of Algiers, the French did crush the insurgents. They won the battle. The body count was always lopsided in France's favor over the course of a conflict that spanned 8 years, 1954 to 62. But France lost the war. It lost its colony in North Africa. As Horn wrote in his conclusion, from the French army's point of view, their tragedy was that at various points they could see with agonizing clarity, and not without reason, that they were winning the war militarily. But not unlike the American commanders in Vietnam, it was not given them to perceive that at the same time their chances of winning the war politically and on the wider world stage were growing ever slimmer. And that's Alistair Horn in A Savage War of Peace. The French presence in Algeria was illegitimate in the eyes of most Algerians, and there was no way for France to beat a different attitude into them. You know, Horn sent a copy of A Savage War of Peace to Defense Secretary Rumsfeld in 2005. It was a way of saying, the U.S. is making the same mistakes in Iraq. It did no good. The U.S. went on destroying Iraq in order to save it. Wars are easy to start but difficult to win, however you define victory. And this has been on my mind a lot lately, as you know from listening to the podcast since February when Russia invaded Ukraine. Why are modern wars so difficult to win? Maybe it's always been that way, but I don't know a lot about ancient warfare. Over the past century, powerful countries have repeatedly failed to impose their will on places like Vietnam, where the U.S. was defeated by a peasant army, although one supported by the USSR and China. War does not work, yet we humans continue to convince ourselves we'll get it right the next time. Now, in the 20th century, some wars were won decisively. Israel defeated the Arab states in a number of conflicts, although Israel's permanent military occupation of the West Bank can hardly be called a victory. And there are other examples. The U.S. and its allies swept Iraq out of Kuwait in 1991, but that outcome may have deluded our leaders into thinking they had mastered warfare, only to see such dreams go to hell after 9/11. Maybe a certain kind of conflict is impossible to win nowadays. Wars of occupation, wars of aggression, wars by powerful states against armies of national liberation. These have something in common if you listen to presidential speeches, whether LBJ, Bush, or Putin. They're framed as rescue efforts, in a way. The U.S. would save not just Vietnam, but the world from communist aggression.
Vietnam is also the scene of a powerful aggression that is spurred by an appetite for conquest. It is the arena where communist expansionism is most aggressively at work in the world today, where it is crossing international frontiers in violation of international agreements, where it is killing and kidnapping, where it is ruthlessly attempting to bend free people to its will. And into this mixture of subversion and war, of terror and hope, America has entered with its material power and with its moral commitment.
A half-century later, the U.S. would liberate Iraqis from their own government.
To all the men and women of the United States Armed Forces now in the Middle East, the peace of a troubled world and the hopes of an oppressed people now depend on you.
And in February, in a rambling televised address, Putin made the absurd claim that Russian forces would save Ukrainians from Nazis in their midst. I have decided to conduct a special military operation, said Putin. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kyiv regime for 8 years. Time and again, rather than throwing bouquets of roses at their occupiers, or to borrow a page from Dick Cheney, their liberators, the occupied tossed hand grenades instead. In an essay titled Why War Fails in Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, historian Lawrence Freedman writes, military power is not only about a nation's armaments and the skill with which they are used. It must take into account the resources of the enemy, as well as the contributions from allies and friends, whether in the form of practical assistance or direct interventions. And although military strength is often measured in firepower by counting inventories of arms and the size of armies, navies, and air forces, much depends on the quality of the equipment, how well it's been maintained, and on the training and motivation of the personnel using it. In any war, writes Freedman, the ability of an economy to sustain the war effort and the resilience of the logistical systems to ensure that supplies reach the front lines as needed is of increasing importance as the conflict wears on. So is the degree to which a belligerent can mobilize and maintain support for its own cause, both domestically and externally, and undermine that of the enemy, tasks that require constructing compelling narratives that can rationalize setbacks as well as anticipate victories. Above all, he writes, military power depends on effective command. And that includes both a country's political leaders, who act as supreme commanders, and those seeking to achieve their military goals as operational commanders. The essay is about Russia's failures in Ukraine, a war many observers believe the invaders would quickly win. Now, the war isn't over yet. No one knows when it may end, and Russia may ultimately batter its way to something it can call victory. Russia will always have military preeminence over its neighbor, as President Obama pointed out in his 2016 interview with The Atlantic. But as of today, Ukraine appears to be winning, says Lawrence Freedman, emeritus professor of war studies at King's College London and the author of the forthcoming book, Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine. Hello, Sir Lawrence.
Good to be with you.
Joining us from the United Kingdom. So, can we say who is winning the war in Ukraine right now?
I'd say the Ukrainians are. I think there's been a view for some time that it's sort of a stalemate, and you certainly can't see yet on the ground the sort of evidence that would lead you to say, yes, the tide has definitely turned. But I think the Ukrainian activity over the last month, for which the Russians yet have had no serious response, and the rather devastating attack on the airport in Crimea a couple of days ago, all of these have undermined Russian self-confidence and given Ukrainians a sense that the new equipment coming in from the West is really making a difference. You can say that they're winning, which is not the same that they will definitely win, because how you bring these wars to an end is, as we've already seen, very complicated.
Yeah, how would we define winning from a Ukrainian point of view?
Well, I think the Ukrainian concept is quite clear, and actually clearer than the Russian, which is they get their territory back. Early on, they might have been happy to get back to the boundaries of 23rd of February 2022. Certainly, getting back anything seized during this current war is the priority.
For Ukraine to expel Russian forces, that seems to be monumentally difficult, wouldn't you say?
I think it's been a remarkable 6 months, almost 6 months now. Everybody assumed that the Russians had enormous advantages. And a lot of the problems the Russians faced were as much the result of their errors as anything clever the Ukrainians did, although the Ukrainians had worked out a pretty sensible strategy in the north. But over time, things have swung more to Ukraine, at least in a qualitative sense. So the basic problem Russia has is it's, in a sense, being forced to rely on old men and old weapons. The attrition has been very heavy. Both the Ukrainians have also suffered significant losses because they mobilized right at the start. They've got more ready troops in reserve. The Russians are scrambling around to get troops to the front. I think more important than that is the Russians have used up a lot of their modern kit. Now, you don't need the most modern artillery to send barrages that cause a lot of damage. But the way that the Ukrainians are using the artillery that they're getting is much more precise, much cleverer, undermines the whole Russian campaign by making their logistics and command so much more difficult. It has been a remarkable turnaround, and the fact that we even think in terms of a potential Ukrainian victory just indicates how substantial that has been.
Well, it is assumed that the war is going to grind into a stalemate, but there are some issues with that assumption. For starters, on the Ukrainian side, its smaller army has to resist exhaustion, has to maintain popular support as the casualties continue to mount, also has to maintain support in the West for military assistance. So far, that hasn't been much of a problem. Do you agree with those observations?
I think on the Ukrainian side, clearly they're very dependent. I mean, they couldn't fight the war without external support. In that sense, they're on life support. I mean, without the West, the IMF, they'd be bankrupt and be looking at a very different situation. So they're very dependent upon that. There hasn't been any problem from the start with Ukrainian domestic support. That hasn't wavered. And the more the war has gone on, the atrocities committed by the Russians have undermined any hope they may have had to win Ukrainians over to the idea of handing over some of their territory. So that there's an issue about Western support. But for the moment, that's also held up surprisingly well, despite the economic troubles we're all going through as a result of the energy crunch. I think we've reached the point where the commitments have been made. Backing away from those commitments would look terrible. It would be seen as a betrayal. And I think the Ukrainians are now doing enough to justify the military support they've got. I think the Russian problem is different. It's not Russian territory that's being attacked. Their problem, I think, is that their army is slowly being diminished. I mean, my view for some time has been that the strain this is putting on the military, Russian military as an institution. They've lost 4 to 5 years of defense production. They just lost a whole load of modern aircraft. This is not something that can be sustained that much longer. So as long as you can see the Ukrainians being able to pick out targets and not wasting ammunition bombarding fields, then I think you're going to see more and more questions in Moscow about how do they actually get out of this. So long as the West stays solid, Ukraine is actually in a better position to take on the attrition than Russia is.
You started to answer my next question about what Russia might be thinking or what Putin might be thinking and how long they can sustain this effort. I mean, they should be out now, really. In a sensible world, they should say, okay, this is not working. But we know that powerful states, even democracies, not necessarily autocracies, can continue to press on in a war because, well, it's just too difficult to admit defeat.
Yeah, that has been the problem since February, almost from day one, that this was not a war that Russia could win, but they might have got something out of it. And they still might think they can get something out of it. But their problem is that the returns on their efforts have been pretty minimal. I mean, basically what they've got now is what they took in the first days of the war, with a little bit added in May and June. And since then, over July, August, very little. They're not sure how to deal with these setbacks. Nothing in the Russian media or in Putin's state has prepared the Russian people for serious difficulties. They know lots of people are getting killed, but these are not necessarily Muscovites or St. Petersburg. So it's just this interesting question is at the point at which they can see that unless they cut their losses, it's going to get much, much worse, or whether they carry on living under the illusion that somehow they can turn it around.
So why don't we talk about the arguments you make in your foreign affairs essay, as well as in your upcoming book, Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine. You make the argument that Russia's problems have to deal with the way they prosecute war. It's a command issue, that they're not fighting wars in a modern way. They're just kind of butting their heads over and over into a wall.
There's an interesting contrast, and a lot of people have made this point, between a very hierarchical system in which orders come from the top down and are not to be questioned, whereas the Western approach, which gives much more latitude to junior officers, to NCOs, who are able to adjust to the situations as they find them on the ground. And you can see this in intercepted communications, complaints about having to wait too long to get permission to attack particular targets. So that's one sense in which a very autocratic hierarchical system lacks flexibility. The other sense, basically, which is what we've already talked about, is that in autocratic systems, it's very difficult to challenge a stupid decision. If your leader is about to do something ridiculous, it's not so easy to say you're about to do something ridiculous because you put your career at risk. Now, it's obviously the case that Western countries have made some pretty poor decisions of their own in the past, but we have at least ways of recognizing this, changing our government, reversing courts. It's much harder in the Russian system. And in my book, I discuss a number of other examples where autocrats feel that because of their supreme power, they can take bold and audacious decisions without really thinking through the consequences if it doesn't turn out as planned.
Well, Putin had been a shrewd operator prior to this. You point out in your essay that his interventions, military interventions, went fairly well, at least from a Russian point of view. The intervention in Syria, Chechnya, Georgia.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, which is one reason why I was personally surprised that he took the decision he did in February. Obviously, something was up, and it was always possible that he would attack on scale. But what has struck me from looking at these previous conflicts you mentioned, Chechnya and Georgia and Syria and Crimea and so on, is that though he'd taken risks, and though he'd been prepared to use armed force, the risks had always been quite calculated. And he knew how to limit his liabilities. So in Syria, they used air power, but not land power. In Ukraine in 2014, He was quite cautious until he realized that Crimea could be taken without too much trouble, and then blew hot and cold with the fighting in the Donbass because he wasn't sure he could get the right result there. So what's interesting is what's changed him from being ruthless, ready to use armed force, but still quite calculating in how he did it, to somebody who's taken a really reckless gamble and bet the whole thing on an operation that has turned out very badly and doesn't know how to get out of it.
And no one's going to confuse me with a military expert, but even I could tell that when that convoy of Russian tanks, single file, heading toward Kyiv, anyone knows you take out the first 2-3 tanks in that column, that causes a roadblock. Then the Ukrainians are able to pick off the others with their anti-tank missiles. I mean, it was hubris. Stupidity? I'm not sure.
I think part of the problem is, and it's not unusual in military operations, of believing that you could have a decisive first blow. If you achieve your basic objectives in day 1 and 2, then everything falls into place. And the problem is when that doesn't happen, then you find yourself caught trying to rescue an initial failure. And the Ukrainians were prepared for the convoy, so they forced the Russians to travel down their road network, and they got caught. It's harder to understand why they distributed their force in the way they did. A lot of commentators have noted that though they had a combined arms doctrine using artillery and armour and infantry in some synchronized way, actually they never had enough infantry to protect the armour. And so the armour kept on getting picked off.
And Sir Anthony Beaver made that same observation on this podcast about the lack of infantry support for the armour.
Yeah.
So Putin made the same mistake, along with his military leaders or whoever's advising him, right? That leaders have made about war for centuries now. It's going to be a short war, an easy victory. I mean, you heard this stuff before the First World War, right? You have to, if you're going to sell your public on something like this, because even in an autocracy, public opinion matters. Yeah. You're not going to go to your people and say, don't worry, we'll get this done in 4 years, you know? And our presence in this country will be seen as legitimate. Well, obviously, the Russians are not viewed as legitimate in Ukraine after what's happened here since February. I think in your upcoming book, you also use the example of the French in Algeria. Yeah. During that awful colonial war. The French tried to impose themselves on a people who, well, the French had long since worn out their welcome there.
You know, a basic proposition about warfare is it's hard to prevail in occupying countries where you're not welcome. I mean, in Algeria, for example, the French army could say they won. They suppressed the Algerian guerrillas.
And they won the Battle of Algiers.
They won the battle using methods that were pretty extreme.
Yeah, torture.
In a way they worked. But what they lost was public support and eventually demonstrations, strikes and so on. And a government in exile was able to put pressure on the French government to get out. That was a classic colonial war, but you can see in our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even where you've got support of a chunk of the population, the government that you're supporting doesn't have legitimacy and authority. You can't create it for them. And so eventually it wears us down. And, you know, again, one would have assumed that Putin was aware of that, which he wouldn't be the first to assume that the people who you're in fact about to try and conquer and oppress actually will welcome you as liberators. You've obviously heard that language about Iraq in 2003. But you could even see it by the Iraqis themselves. Saddam Hussein in 1980, when he invaded Iraq, he thought that there would be a welcome.
The Iran-Iraq war went on for, 8-9 years, killed probably 1 million people or more, was one of the last World War II-style conventional wars, ended indecisively. It seems most modern wars end indecisively, that total victory is an illusion. World War II was an anomaly in that sense.
There have been wars. I mean, Israel's wars in 67 and 73, you could argue, ended with a pretty clear-cut result. India's war against Pakistan, from which we now have Bangladesh, was a pretty decisive victory. So not all wars end in stalemate and with insurgencies, but a lot do. You know, a lot of contemporary warfare It's not like the Iran-Iraq war where you had regular forces battling against each other. A lot of it's fought in jungles or in urban areas between militias. It's very hard to bring it to a close because the conditions which caused the conflicts in the first place haven't been dealt with and they just keep on reappearing. So all wars are different, but there's certainly a type largely where it's a civil war.
Or maybe we people on this planet continue to fool ourselves that having more military power means we can solve a problem. I mean, take a look at the Russians in Ukraine, although that war is not over. The United States in Vietnam, the Russians in Afghanistan. Maybe military power means less today than it once did, if you know what I mean.
Military power, it's easier to use defensively than offensive.
Yeah, the defense always seems to have the advantage in modern war.
I think one of the things that's been quite striking in this war and others is the strength of defenses. I mean, one of the things we've seen in Ukraine is just how strong defenses can be. But I think if you're looking, therefore, at military power as a way of changing a status quo to your advantage rather than stopping something bad happening, it's not got a great record. It normally comes with costs and unexpected consequences. Again, one of the issues out after this war is the lessons that others will draw. For example, in China, about whether they're absolutely sure that if they go to war against Taiwan, that's a war that not only they can win, but won't have consequences.
Well, the lessons they may learn is we see the mistakes, but we'll get it right when we do it. You know, powerful countries continue to make this mistake, and that is war works as a tool of statecraft or as a failure of statecraft. The United States has the most lethal, sophisticated killing machine in world history, right? I mean, our army can't be defeated on a battlefield, right? But at the same time, we had trouble imposing victory in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam. I mean, time and again, I mentioned the Soviets in Afghanistan, the French in Algeria. War doesn't work. Do I sound like a hippie when I say that?
I've studied a lot of them, and as I say, there are wars where governments achieve their objectives and look back on them with pride. And these are often wars which somebody else started. So there are some situations where the resort to armed force is a legitimate last resort. You can see why countries do it. It's when you have a belief that you can deal with a rival country or a neighbor that you find irritating and your political problems will be solved that you normally see the trouble.
I don't find too many of the comparisons to the 1930s to be all that convincing, but what Russia is doing here is a war of aggression straight out of that period. You know,
a straightforward war of aggression. Yeah. By the Charter of the United Nations, this is a war of aggression. Whenever you may think about whether the NATO or Ukraine had wise policies beforehand, in the end, this is a war of aggression. But it's often the case that there is assumption about weakness on the other side that makes these wars seem more attractive. And just as Hitler had contempt for the democracies, I think Putin has his own contempt for the democracies. I think many people have been surprised by the way that they stand up to the aggression. Yeah. So despite a lot of assumptions about Western Europe sort of caving in, they didn't cave in.
Well, as the United States learned in Vietnam, war is never just a military affair. The politics are always important. I mean, that's the argument in your book. You talk about the politics of command. I believe it was George Clemenceau who said war is too important to be left to the generals. It's often been said, keep the politicians out of the war, let the generals handle it. But politics, public support at home, public support in the other country, right? This is always critical.
Yeah, I think Clemenceau was making a point which one would still make and is still important in democratic countries about civilian accountability. But the point in the book, it goes further, is that you still require generals with a political sensibility, because especially if they're going to be operating in countries that are not their own, that they don't necessarily understand very much, or if they're working with allies, all of these things require good commanders to have an understanding of politics. If I open the book with Eisenhower, who was not exactly everybody's example of a dashing battlefield commander. He hadn't done that before. He was brilliant at the politics. He understood how to hold a coalition together, how to cope with
Montgomery's ego.
with Montgomery and Patton and all these very egotistical generals.
Yes, Dwight Eisenhower was masterful in that department. So if Russia were to win, what would it be winning at this point? A destroyed country, right? The Donbass has been leveled. I mean, there was a low-level civil war there for 8 years. A people that will resent its presence in their country, talking about the Ukrainians. You know, whatever pro-Russian attitudes existed in the eastern part of the country, it is a mystery in the end, in the final analysis. Same with the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Why these leaders believe that they couldn't get what they wanted through other means.
It is strange because, you know, the whole rationale for this war was that the people of the Donbass were under threat from Kyiv, from the Ukrainian government, and they had to be protected and liberated. Whereas the consequence of this war is the ruination of that whole region. I mean, including the bits that were sponsored by Russia before. And so there's no prize here. It'll be a resentful population. You know, they're talking about taking people from Ukraine and relocating them in Russia, Russifying Luhansk and Donetsk, and even. Nothing's going to be stable in this situation. There's no stability that can be produced. And one of the real problems that we have in dealing with Russia is that having started off with certain objectives about changing the government in Kyiv, once that wasn't achieved, all they could do is turn to brutality. It's almost as if we can't have Ukraine, nobody else can really have Ukraine. So there's something really quite vicious.
My final question to you, or final thoughts, is Sir Max Hastings was here a few months ago, talking about the early stages of the war, and he said as he gets older, he understands that each country has its own set of logics, that maybe we can't understand them from our Western point of view, but these are the logics that work in Russia, that they have this way of doing war where they're just going to batter their way to something they can call victory, that they don't care about human life, is how Max Hastings put it. Well, what are your thoughts on that and how they're ruining the country? In the end, in the final analysis, it doesn't make any sense.
If you watch Russian media, watch what they've been saying for some time now, well before the war, there's a sort of hubris. There's almost an insecurity. We're a great power. People need to treat us as a great power. We mustn't show a single moment of weakness. And we're not weak, but others are weak. And therefore, we must show how they're vulnerable to our power and our strength. And it's a very uncompromising vision of Russia, its relationship to the world, and its ability to use force. And that's why I think one of the real crises for Russia that will come, as they have to come to terms with the fact that it doesn't work, that this bullying, in the end, has not got them what they want, has left them friendless, by and large.
Well, China and India haven't abandoned Russia, for sure.
They see themselves as a European country, but they have no credibility left in Europe, while Putin is in power. It's going to take an awful long way from something like this to reintegrate Russia again into the international community.
Sir Lawrence Freedman, we thank you for joining us. And remember, you can check out his essay in Foreign Affairs, the title, Why War Fails. And his book is coming out in September, Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine. On the next episode of History as It Happens, never in American history has an ex-president, especially one as tainted as Donald Trump, dominated the news. Closing in on 2 years since the end of his term, and it's like he never left Washington.
As we secure the border, another key priority for the next Congress and the next president will be to drain the swamp once and for all. To remove rogue bureaucrats and root out the deep state, Congress should pass groundbreaking reform.
Did Hoover or LBJ or Nixon, any president who left office under a cloud of failure or scandal, ever make so many headlines for even a week? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.